Hello, and welcome to this video on how to create documentaries. So I've been playing around using Shotcut to try and develop ways to make documentaries. Looked at some tutorials myself, trying to teach myself how to do all this, and I made a documentary about this man, Nagai Takashi, pictured here. And just, you remember, I also made a podcast about Nagai Takashi. Just to note, I was supposed to present at the Association for Asian Studies in Boston. The presentation was supposed to be in March of 2020, and it was canceled because of the COVID virus. So I wasn't able to present my paper, and so I've been thinking a lot about this guy and wanting to do something with some of the things I learned about him. So I decided to make the podcast about him, decided to make my documentary about him. But so this is the first thing about making a documentary is that first of all, you need a big idea, but not too big. So initially I thought, you know what, for my documentary, I'm going to do the biography, the life of Nagai Takashi. And then I started to storyboard it, and I'll talk about what storyboarding is shortly. And I realized, you know what, that's going to be just way too long to go over this guy's entire life. I'm going to end up with at least a half an hour documentary. And while I think that would be interesting, and maybe one day I will make a long documentary about the life of Nagai Takashi, now's not the time to do it. I just want to make a short documentary to give you a sense of how to do it. So I needed to make my big idea smaller. And what I ended up deciding to do was to focus on his life during and immediately after the dropping of the atomic bomb and the ideas in his writings. And even that was kind of big. That ended up being like 9 minutes. So that's a pretty long documentary. It's going to be longer than what I require for you. But you want a big idea, but one that's not too big, right? And the major thing I wanted people to get was just, and especially I think this is appropriate with the COVID-19 virus going on right now. You can see how the present situation impacts the how we understand history. I thought it would be nice to give kind of a hopeful story, not in a historical story in the sense that, oh, everything was great, but one of like, okay, here's someone who suffered a lot. Here's kind of how he made sense of his suffering to help give people hope. So in a sense, I'm taking something really bad, or something that did a lot of damage to human lives, the atomic bombing, and then trying to look at how people made sense of it and made it better. And that's kind of my big idea, right? How does this guy try and make sense of his suffering and use his writings to help make life better for other people and give them hope during a difficult time? So that was my big idea. And I found that I could do that mostly by focusing on his post-atomic bomb life and writings. So the first thing, so you got to have your big idea, kind of what you want to do it about. And then the next thing you have to do is make a storyboard, right? Remember, a documentary, unlike a podcast, is visual. And if you watch like anything about making movies or cartoons or anything like that, they storyboard. And a storyboard is basically where you come up with your various scenes and the ideas kind of connected with them. So to kind of go through and show you my storyboard, right? So this is my opening credits, and I'll talk more about how to make those later. But my second part of my storyboard was just saying that, hey, the atomic bomb was being dropped on Nagasaki. And I have an image associated with that. That's part of the whole idea of a storyboard, is that you have an image that sets the scene. And then I have another one, the atomic bomb is dropped on Nagasaki B. So I wanted to make a point here. I wanted to emphasize the damage that was done through the atomic bomb. So it made sense to, people have seen this kind of image. I want to highlight the mushroom cloud. And then I found this wonderful before and after picture of Nagasaki. And I say wonderful in the sense that it illustrates my point about the devastation. I mean, this is not wonderful. If you look at this, you can see a lot of people suffered on account of this. So that's kind of my big intro is, boom, this is about the atomic bomb. Something bad happened. And then I tried to narrow it down a bit. So the next part of my storyboard was how it exploded over the Catholic cathedral there. And again, there's this image that's just really devastating that depicts what's going on here. And then I wanted to focus a little bit more, but instead of talking about Nagai Takashi, I decided to talk about his wife. And I noted how she was one of the victims of this blast. Now, one thing I want to point out, like I said, documentaries are visual, so you want to find good images to use. And one thing I made a mistake here, you should really only have one image per PowerPoint. Like I said, I'm learning how to do this myself. When you watch my documentary, you're going to see, I made some mistakes. That's fine. one mistake, and I wanted to preserve those mistakes because I think that's a better way to highlight it for you all, so you can say, okay, these are some things where you can go wrong and still make I think it's a decent documentary, even though I made some mistakes. I should have had one image per PowerPoint, not two, because what happens then is I end up making one sound file for two images, and that makes things really tricky. Remember, it should be one sound file per image, one sound file per image. It makes your life so much easier, and I broke my rule, and that made my life difficult. So do not do what I did here. What I should have done was what I did up here with the atomic bombs. Notice I have the same idea. The atomic bomb is dropped on Nagasaki, but I have A and B. And so I have the same idea, but I've just broken it up into two parts. That's why I used A and B. But like I said, I made a mistake there. And then I went through and I talked about the how her death... I'm sorry, I should say why I have these two images. So you have her, and then I wanted to show her melted rosary, because I talked about how she was killed, and they found in the blast, and how they found the remains. They found her melted rosary amongst the remains. Then I talked about how she had a husband and children, and those are the children at her grave. And then that gave me kind of room to introduce her husband. And once again, I made the same error here of having two images per slide, and I should not have done that. That makes the editing part much more difficult. So do not do what I did. And then I talked about how what made this particularly difficult was Nagai was suffering from leukemia, right? So, this poor guy, right? He loses his wife and is now has to take care of the children by himself. And, he's dying. And he was a radiologist, and he got leukemia through his work. So he was this medical doctor. So this guy really has a hard time. Of course, everything's devastated, and then Japan surrenders. And a large part of what I was trying to emphasize in this video was how this guy kind of loses everything. And we can make sense of loss when we are victorious. It's like, okay, I lost family members, but at least we won the war. At least their sacrifice wasn't for nothing. But in this case, the guy loses the war. And so what was the sacrifice for, right? And then I just talk about how he used science to, he was a scientist. Like I said, he's a radiologist, so he studied the effects of radioactivity in the area. And I just want to highlight, notice how the images are all connected with the main point, right? I'm trying to emphasize here Nagai and his relationship with Midori. So I included a picture of him with her and his son, their son. And then I talked about his military service. I included a picture of him as a soldier. I talked about him having leukemia. I showed him being treated by a doctor while he's clearly suffering from an illness. Talk about Japan surrender. Here's the Japanese surrendering. Talk about Nagai being a scientist. There he is with what appears to be a kind of microscope. Then I talked about his ideas, how I tried to make sense of loss. And in particular, and I should have, just to show you, I should have done this a little bit differently. I should have made the image, change the layout, and then I can make the image bigger. I used this image to illustrate one of his major ideas, where he talked about Mary, the mother of Jesus, going to heaven on like a cloud, and then his own wife going to heaven on a mushroom cloud. You'll watch the documentary, so I won't go too much into detail, but you can see I've carefully chosen the images. One thing that's kind of a problem when people make PowerPoint presentations, I notice, is they'll pick a bunch of images that have nothing to do with what they're talking about. It's kind of like, this image is cool, I'll show it, but I'm not going to mention it in my presentation, and it's just kind of separate. And that's bad in a PowerPoint presentation. It's even worse in a documentary, right? Remember, a documentary is visual. Visuals are very important. They have to be closely connected with what you're saying. If they don't, what's the point, right? Why this visual, and why are you making a documentary? And I would go so far as to say, if you don't have good visuals, you need to do a different subject for your documentary, right? Your documentary has to incorporate good visuals integrated with your narrative. So I have to stress, I took a lot of time to try and find really good images and make sure that they were connected. So I talked about his books, and so I used covers of his books, which made sense. And notice I did this properly here. Instead of trying to put both books on the same slide, I had a separate slide and a separate sound file for each book. Then I included, and this is important, you want to include at least some primary source. So I read part of a primary source that was, again, connected closely to his ideas. And in those, it was longer, so I had to divide it into 3 slides. And I want to stress again, and this is the power of visuals and the power of documentaries, is you use the images and their connection with the text to really emphasize ideas. So in the text I was quoting, Nagai was emphasizing the physical destruction and the devastation. And that's why I chose these images, because I thought they show them very well. But in the last part, he talked about this idea of being on a journey, right? Of traveling, of carrying a burden. And so I picked this image of people on a journey carrying burdens. And this is from Nagasaki. So you can see I use the image to emphasize the ideas. And you may not pick on that consciously, but I think subconsciously people will pick up on that. So it's very important to carefully choose your images. Then I wanted to make things a little bit more hopeful, right? I wanted to kind of emphasize hope. So that's why I chose, because he was trying to emphasize that, right? He's dealing with all this suffering, but then he tries to find hope. So I chose this picture of him smiling with his kids. And this shows the suffering. I mean, he's still bedridden, but this is a happy moment we have here. Then I was able to find he donated cherry tree. I wanted to talk about how he used the money he made from his books to help people. And I knew that there was a story about him donating money to buy cherry trees. And I found this wonderful image of cherry blossoms at Nagasaki. So I used that. And again, this is where you have to know stuff, right? I knew that I had done a lot of research on him. I knew that he had done this. So I was able to very quickly find this. So this is like, say, you have to really know your subject. Then I talked about the As Yourself hut. So I included a picture of the hut. And then I included a picture to mark when he died. And one thing I want to note about this, later we're going to talk about transitions and zooms and pans and things like that. So when you make a documentary, you don't want it just to be still images, right? You don't want it just to be still images. You have to have some kind of movement, and you do that through zooms. Now the question is, there's two places I could have zoomed here. I could have zoomed in on him. That might seem morbid because, I mean, he's deceased in this image. Or I could zoom in on the family, and that might make sense, but isn't the focus on him, not his family? Well, I would argue that the focus should be on his family because Nagai was really trying to think of how to give hope, especially to people who he knew would continue on after he died. So because of that, I chose to zoom in during the documentary of his family, and I'll talk more about how to do those kinds of zooms later. But in this image, like I said, you have two focal points, the family and Nagai. Could have logically focused on either one, but I chose to focus on them for that reason. I then talked about Nagai's funeral, and then I ended by talking about Nagai's legacy. Right? Then I ended by talking about Nagai's legacy. So this is something we really want to emphasize very closely here. The one thing I want to note, even though I have titles, those titles are just to help me think about what I'm doing. And when you turn in your storyboard, you need to have those titles. But when you actually make the documentary, it should just be the images. Right? It should just be the images. This is just to help organize things. Right? This is how you get the images. This is how you organize your thought. Now, once you have done that, right, and and this is kind of a back and forth process. It's not simply like, okay, you do the storyboard, then you write the script. You're going to go back and forth. But in addition to a storyboard, you need a script, just like what we have with the podcast. So you'll note that my script matches the slides, which all match the image. This is why I said it's important to have one image per slide, and why I messed up by breaking that rule. I got kind of lazy, I think, and I paid for it later on by having it cause more work. But see, there's the atomic bomb is dropped on Nagasaki A. The atomic bomb is dropped on Nagasaki A. So the idea is, when this image shows on the documentary, I'm going to be reading this. Right? When this image shows in the documentary, I'm going to read this. When this image shows in the documentary, I'm going to be reading this. When this image shows on the documentary, I'm going to be reading this. Right? You see how that works. So you have this tied, and it makes things very easy. One image, one thing to read, one sound file. It makes things line up very nicely. Now, one thing I want to emphasize, don't think it's simply like, okay, I did the storyboard and then I did the documentary. It's a bit more complex than that. You're going to go back and forth. Like, as I wrote, some of these got really long, and I'm like, okay, I actually should have two images, not just one, because that way I can split it up more. Or this is really short, I should combine this with something else. So I want to stress, if you do this right, you're going to go back and forth. You may change the images, you may change the order based on how the script goes. Whatever it does, that's fine. It's going to be a little bit messy. That's okay. That's just how you try and bring these things together. You're going to go back and forth between the two. And just so you know, I don't know if you saw that, that's a really nice trick if your monitor is big enough, that if you put it in the corner here, it'll pop like that, and then you can have two windows that kind of share, and that makes your life a lot easier. One thing also you have to emphasize is that you really want to make sure that there's a kind of transition. There's a logical connection between the two, right? You don't want to just have it be too much of a jump. Like here, I think I maybe had too much of a jump because I said they had been evacuated the countryside and therefore did not directly experience the atomic bomb. And then the next slide is Nagai Takashi had served in the army during Japan's invasion of China as a medical officer. I should have figured out a better way to transition there. This is a better transition though, because I talk about how he was working at the at the Nagasaki Medical School, and then the next slide is he was at medical school at work when the bomb exploded. So this is a much better transition. I did not have a good transition here. So you want to think about that. These, in a sense, are discrete units, but there has to be some kind of connection between them.